welcome everyone. It's very exciting to see so many participants here already. It's very exciting also to see so many countries, so many different countries. Well, you know me already. I'm Ruth Baptista. I'm the Professional Development Officer for eTwinning, and some of you are used to attend the events that we organize. Um, Today we are going to talk about assessment for learning, and I will present the topic and our guest speaker for today in a minute. With no further ado, I would like to present today's topic and our guest speaker. So today's topic refers to classroom assessment that is designed to improve learning. In short, we hope with this seminar to provide a discussion which clarifies some fundamental assessment concepts and to discuss the fundamental role that assessment plays in the teaching learning processes. To talk about this, I invited Domingos Fernandes. He's a full professor at the Institute of Education of the University of Lisboa in Portugal, where he is the coordinator of undergraduate courses and graduate programs in educational evaluation and assessment. He is a senior researcher at the research unit in education and training of the University of Lisboa as well. Also, he has been a visiting professor in both national and international universities, where he normally teaches courses such as evaluation theory, classroom assessment, program evaluation, and curriculum and assessment. He has published more than 100 articles, books, book chapters, and other publications. And his last article, Teaching and Assessing in Higher Education, Reflections Based upon Research Done with the Avena Project, was published recently in Brazil. I also had the pleasure to have him as my teacher, so I'm sure we will have a very interesting seminar. So with no further ado, Professor Domingos, I will now put up your presentation. And welcome and thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you. Well, let me say hi to everybody and thank you for coming to this seminar. I hope that you're listening to me well. Of course, that it's a pleasure to be here, and I have to thank the European SchoolNet for inviting me to share some of my works, some of my reflections with you concerning assessment issues. Of course, that I would like to tell you that I will approach assessment from a pedagogical point of view, and when I speak about assessment, I'm referring to the actions that we take within classrooms and within schools concerning the issue of knowing what students are learning or what kind of difficulties we may face in that learning process. I will try to follow these 5 points. I would like to share with you some relevant developments in education in these last 30 years. Very short approach, but I would like to point some really relevant developments in these last 30 years. And what I mean is that somehow we need to get some understanding about what do we know about some important issues concerning the education of children and the education of youth. Then I will share with you some critical questions concerning assessment, and After that, I will talk a little bit about assessment for learning and assessment of learning. These actually are designations that are uh, that emerged some years ago, some 10, 15 years ago, maybe a little more, I don't know for sure, but it came from research that has been done in Europe and particularly in England, in Great Britain, if you will, because one of the most proeminent researchers that came with this notion of assessment for learning, Professor Paul Black, is Scottish. Another one is Dillon Williams, who is from England. And then I will come up with some final considerations. So, when I talk about some relevant developments in education, I, I like to share this important and, in my opinion, fundamental essay that this lady called Lorraine Resnick, a cognitivist, a North American cognitivist. I was studying in the United States at that time, and of course that this essay was a critical uh, essay, a critical reading for me that actually affected me in good sense until today, from then until today. And after all, what did Lauren Resnick tell us in this essay at that time? Well, as the title of the essay states, education has to do with learning to think, and this is a fundamental point, uh, which means that we need to make all our efforts, we need to join our efforts in order for children and youth learn to think. That's one of the major purposes of schooling. And she stated some important issues. One of them is that writing is of fundamental importance for learning, of course. Writing and reading. She pointed out that without writing, without reading, with comprehension, with understanding, it's very difficult for human beings to progress in the education process. The other thing that she emphasizes a lot was the importance of problem solving. Problem solving not just in mathematics, but problem solving as a challenge to students. A challenge that means that they have to think in order to solve the given problem. And this, of course, can be done within mathematics, but can be done within science or within mother language or within history, whatever. Another thing, I cannot, of course, um, uh, tell you everything that important things that are in this essay, but another thing is that she pointed out that assessment is a crucial point, it's a crucial issue, I must say, in order to improve student learning. At that time, she made that she said that at that time. I'm sorry because my English is not so fluent as I would like, but I hope that you are following me. Let's move to almost 10 years later, and we had these two gentlemen. Uh, on the bottom, you have Professor Paul Black, and on the top you have Professor Dillon Williams. They made a meta-analysis in 1998. They published that meta-analysis, which is, as you know, an analysis of uh, a number of studies. Actually, they analyzed almost 250 studies all over the world in all types of disciplines, all types of classrooms, and I cannot go into details, but they made several points which are extremely important and that they influenced significantly the discussion on assessment issues. And one of the things that they said was that assessment makes a big difference in students' learning. In other words, they said, based upon that research, that meta-analysis, that when students are in classrooms where assessment is organized to help them to learn, providing them quality feedback, uh, not focusing on grading, but rather in learning, assessment associated with learning, assessment integrated with the process of learning and teaching in those three processes, assessment, teaching, and learning together. Well, when this happens, students' learning improves dramatically, improves. Well, I don't want to go into technical issues, but the effect size that they calculated was very big, you know, when formative assessment, as we used to call at that time, and we still call, of course, uh, what I mean by formative assessment is assessment that that the major purpose of that assessment is to improve learning. You know, assessment that is very close to the students, that provides feedback. That's what I mean. So when students are exposed to this kind of assessment, their learning improves dramatically, and they understand better what they are learning. This is a very interesting point. The other interesting point of the Paul Black and Dillon Williams research is that they said, well, all the students improve a lot when they are exposed to formative assessment. But the ones that get the most out of formative assessment are the ones that have more difficulties. And this is really interesting, you know. This I had the privilege of participating in several meetings at the international level, and no one goes to those meetings in assessment and in education and without speaking about this work, without speaking about this major result, major finding, if you will. Let us go forward and to share another important, in my opinion, of course, finding and important reflections by Michael Young, that in 2008 they said, well, we have a wide variety of knowledge, a school knowledge, if you will, that needs to be learned by students. But we also have uh, several processes, you know, that are quite important in order for students to learn how to use that content, you know. So basically, what Michael Young told us and has been telling us, fortunately, is that learning uh, is has these two components: content learning, which he said that is extremely important, that without it we are not doing well, if I may say so, a good job. Students need to learn the content, the school knowledge, if you will, in the different disciplines, but at the same time they need to learn quite a wide range of processes in order to go ahead in their learning. Another uh, researcher, Ronald Barnett, 1 year later, stated something that I really appreciate, which he has a vision of curriculum. And he says, well, curriculum as a knowledge project. He sees curriculum as a project, after all, that will allow one to develop knowledge. These two researchers, Michael Young and Ronald Barnett, after all, they are uh, underlining the importance of knowledge, the importance of learning mathematics, mother language, and so forth. The disciplines, the content of the different disciplines. But of course, that they don't forget capacities, and they don't forget something that, for example, in my country, is not regarded with as as I would and many people would like to see. It's being, learning how to be in society, how to be with others, learning to respect each other, learning, type of civic education. And Barnett, after all, he says, well, we need these three pillars, these three important aspects of education: content, capacities, and being. Learning content, learning capacities to use that content, and being in order to be a citizen, in a democratic society. Um, so, in these last 30 years, if you will, and of course this is a selection, I cannot speak about everything, but we have the relevance of writing, the relevance of social interaction, of integrating, mobilizing, and using knowledge, because knowledge by itself is useless if you don't integrate, things, if you don't integrate content, if you don't integrate um, different definitions, different um, learning from different perspectives, and to mobilize and use that knowledge. Another aspect that is quite important is students' autonomy. And this should be worked since the children are very young. And of course, transversal capacities like those that Michael Young, for example, refers to, and like Lorin Resnick also emphasizes. Then we have this idea of curriculum for learning. Curriculum should be seen as something that is dynamic. Uh, Actually, I usually say to my students that curriculum is life. You know, doesn't to me does not make any sense if you don't look at curriculum as part of life and an important part of life. Otherwise, we will ignore the beauty of the world. Otherwise, we ignore the social problems of the world. So curriculum is something that needs to be reinvented at all times. We need to think about it. We need to reinvent it. We need to question it. Right? And of course, this has to be linked to the relevance of school knowledge. The other aspect, the third one, is the importance of working towards the integration of learning, teaching, and assessment. This is for the future, but we are already working on this. Of course, that we still have some problems that I cannot, discuss right now about this issue, because we have different theories for learning, for teaching, and for assessment, and we need to integrate the theories themselves. And this takes time, but we need to work on this direction. Then we have what brought us here today, the emergence of assessment for learning. As the expression says, assessment for learning means that we are assessing in order for students to learn what they are supposed to learn, or what we think that they are supposed to learn. And the emergence of assessment for learning as a unique means to regulate and to improve learning. Of course, to improve teaching too, right? But we are focusing here on learning, because learning, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people, I believe, should be in the center of our intelligent efforts to improve education. And finally, the relevance of civic education, as I mentioned to you before, learning how to be with others, learning how to deal with differences, and so on. Talking about some critical questions on assessment, well, let me share with you some of these critical questions. The first one is that the most fundamental purpose of any assessment process is to discern quality, is discerning quality. And this means, of course, that as a good friend of mine used to tell me, Domingos, when we assess, when we are, after all, we are trying to find what is the quality of our environment, what is the quality of what is around us, And of course, that when we are in school settings, the major purpose of assessment is to find out if students are learning with quality, if they are understanding, and if they are deeply understanding what they are supposed to learn. So we need to think and discuss, of course, and reflect upon this important statement. Assessment and quality are inseparable concepts. They are together. They must be together. Another thing that usually provides is an opportunity for long discussions among researchers and among myself and my students, my graduate students, is that assessments are subjective by nature. And here in my country, in Portugal, when we speak about subjective, everybody is a little suspicious about that, but we need to read, we need to go to philosophy and see that if something is subjective, does not mean that it's inaccurate, or that is something that doesn't have any value. So subjectivity, as I mentioned to you, subjectivity and precision are compatible. Uh, of course, that this goes together with another statement that sometimes we discuss, that assessment is not an exact science, is not a hard science. Of course, that this does not mean that assessment is something that we do on a random basis. No, we have processes to make assessments very accurate. We have different approaches that allow us to come up with nice assessments. And remember, my friends, I'm speaking about assessment inside the classroom. I'm not speaking about large-scale assessment, right? Which is a technology, is a very sophisticated technology. I'm speaking about the daily work of the teacher with his or her students. And of course, that the judgments that we do, they are influenced by a wide variety of elements that, and the final judgment about what a student knows or not is, of course, of subjective nature. And this is not bad to be. We need to know that and assume that. So, assessments, generally speaking, of course, are not definitive judgments. And this is easy to understand if we think that, a student today might not show that he have learned whatever we taught or we are teaching, and some days later he can do it. So we made an assessment today that, well, was not very good, if we may say so, about the state of the learning of the student, but that can change in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. Thus, the results of assessment are not really useful for long periods of time. We need to be aware of this particularity. Uh, Sorry. I have this slide to share with you something that I think needs discussion and needs analysis and needs reflection. Because on one hand we have what we usually say call criteria-based assessment, and I would say that this domain, this is um, the most used type of assessment all over the world. And you know, uh, we set up criteria, and based upon those criteria, we assess our students. This type of assessment, which is very used in all over the world, in all the classrooms, all the countries, is based upon criteria, as I mentioned to you, and it is very influenced for the logic of science. And there is nothing wrong with that. On the contrary, it's important. So it looks for objectivity. It seeks objectivity, which is something that we human beings are always trying to do, seeking objectivity. Many researchers will state that objectivity is a good idea, but we never reach it. We never really find it. If you understand, I hope that you are understanding what I'm trying to say. But anyway, it's a good idea. It's a good idea to come up with some objectivity or total objectivity if it's possible. So also this tends to be a quantitative type of assessment with students participating. It's a low participation because normally we are focused upon results, and we tend to use the so-called paper and pencil tests in order to assess what students are doing, what students are learning or have learned. Of course, that tests are very useful means to collect large amounts of information inside the classroom, you know. But the problem is not with the tests. The tests have no problem. The tests are any instruments. The question of assessment has not to do with instruments, has to do with the use that make of that information. Okay? Well, let's look at the experience-based assessment. I may say that this emerged since the 80s of last century, and it starts to take into account the subjective aspects of assessment. So assumes subjectivity. and tends to be qualitative in nature, and calls for a high participation of students, and is focused more on processes than on results. But, my opinion, my modest opinion, I have these strange lines or black lines over there. What I mean is that there should be a relationship between these two approaches, because if we use both, I believe that assessment might enable one with a more accurate picture of reality. Because after all, what we try to do when we assess is we are trying to take a clean and clean picture, accurate picture of what students know and are what students have learned and what students know to do. I like to Well, there is some problem here with this slide, but I like to call for this saying by Robert Stake, which is it's very inspiring. His books have been inspiring me for 30 years or so. He's now in his 90s and he's in good health. That's great. Um, so he says, this is of course free translation from a book that I have read in Spanish, but I also, have other publications from him in English. But here I translate freely, and he said something like this: experience does not guarantee that we are getting uh, accurate assessments of what we are trying to assess. Okay? So I'm going to repeat. Experience, you know, is not a guarantee that we are going to do a very nice assessment, an accurate assessment. But, he said, if experience is what he means by experience is the close contact with students, interaction, social interaction with students, the experience of the teachers themselves with that interaction and with the assessments that they perform. So what he says is, if experience is absent, then we can be almost sure, almost certain that we will get an inaccurate assessment of that same reality, of that learning or what we are assessing. So after all, he ends up suggesting that we should try to articulate both perspectives. That's why I have those red lines. Articulating is not easy, it's not linear. No, so that's why I make those lines like I was a kid joking a little bit or whatever. Well, so this is another point that I would like to make. And now I would like to share with you some ideas about assessment for and of learning. Of course, that um, we I have been talking about formative assessment and summative assessment, and more recently, as I have said before, we are using the expression assessment for learning um, instead of formative assessment, with the same meaning, but probably not exactly the same meaning. We today, if we compare what we know about assessment in our days, and what we knew in the 70s, there is a big difference. A big difference in theoretical terms. We know much more about how people learn. We know much more about how to teach, different approach to teaching. We know much more about theories or theories of assessment. So, as I mentioned to you before, assessment for learning can contribute to improve quite significantly what students learn and be able to do. And this is not um, a surprise, if I may say so, because assessment for learning has to do with a close assessment, as I used to say in Portuguese. I don't know if it makes sense in English, but it's not a distant assessment. It's an assessment that I go into the classroom and I walk among the students and I ask them, what are you doing? Why are you doing why are you doing this in this manner? Can you tell me why did you do this or that? So it means interaction. It means social interaction, and this is extremely important. And has to do with assessment, because it, depending on the answer of the student, I might uh, provide him or her with some feedback, trying to orient him in order for him or her to develop the efforts that are necessary for him or her to learn, you know. And as I mentioned to you also before, students who tend to have learning difficulties are the ones who take the most out of the systematic use of assessment for learning. And this is not my talk, This is a very powerful result from research of Paul Black and Dillon Williams. Let me share with you very briefly how we saw assessment in the 70s and how we saw it later today. So beginning in the 70s, if we have a curriculum unit, usually we would teach with very little social interaction with the students, and you would go on this black line, until a formative assessment was performed, And the conception of formative assessment at that time was that, well, I will simplify it a little bit. It's not very good, but I have no much time. So formative assessment was kind of preparation for some summative assessment. Formative assessment in this context, in this model, we may call it like that, in this diagram that I present to you, is a kind of a test. For example, we could use a test to assess what students know. But the difference between formative assessment and summative assessment at that time was that formative assessment was not used to grade students, and summative assessment was used to grade students. So we had here a kind of preparation to summative assessment. So it was a very limited vision of formative assessment because, the theoretical means, the heuristic means that we had at that time did not allow more for and this was very revolutionary at that point in time, because formative assessment emerged as an assessment that tried to help students to learn better, but the yellow um, arrows, you know, if you, I don't know if you are following me, but I hope that you are following me now in this regard. If a student had a problem on the very beginning, we would not do anything about it until we perform the formative assessment. So this kind of retroactive type of formative of assessment. Do you know what I mean? If the student had a problem in the middle of the curriculum unit, I would only find it out almost in the final, uh, almost when the unit was ending. Let's look at the evolution for the 80s. In the 80s, we made progress. The human beings and the teachers and the researchers made some progress concerning the and the most important thing here, you see, is that now formative assessment accompanies teaching and learning. So it's not just in the end that you perform formative assessment. You perform it in a continuous manner. You know, it tends to be continuous. It tends to accompany, um, is together with teaching and with learning. And then at the end of the unit, you would perform some sort of summative assessment that could be a test or can be oral questioning or whatever, or an essay, whatever you find out as appropriate, you know. And this is a revolutionary in terms of the conception of the 70s. Actually, this came from a conference that took place in Switzerland, uh, where several researchers questioned the other approach that I just showed to you before, and were influenced by cognitivism and constructivism approaches, and they came up with this fundamental idea of assessment linked, integrated with teaching and learning. And summative assessment here was aimed at grading students. Formative assessment is not aimed at grading students. Formative assessment, the major purpose of formative assessment, or if you will, assessment for learning, is to improve learning. It's the major purpose. There is no such a purpose of using assessment for learning to grade students. Students are graded through certain types of summative assessment, or, if you will, certain types of assessment of learning. Let's go to the most, I would say that this is the most current thinking about assessment for learning and assessment of learning. Uh, the the idea is the same continuity about assessment for learning. Uh, and of course, sometimes we have, um, sorry, I have AF, I should have AF instead of FA. I'm sorry about this. And AS instead of SA. So the yellow one means formative assessment or assessment for learning. The black one means summative assessment or assessment of learning. Well, what I would like to tell you is that the most contemporary thinking about assessment for learning and assessment of learning, or if you will, formative and summative assessment, is that we should have two types of summative assessment. I mean, I can perform, because what is summative assessment? Summative assessment is a kind of state of the art of what students know at a certain point in time, you know. So we can do this through a test, or we can do this asking students to write what they have learned in last week, and they write it, and you look at it and make the state of the art of the entire classroom, the entire students, and provide them with feedback, and do not use that in order to grade them. So you can do that, or you can use exactly the same thing, but you mobilize those results in order to grade the students. So this must be transparent, this must be known by students, and of course, I don't know if I made myself clear, But the idea is that inside the classroom, and remember, I'm talking about what the type of assessments that occur inside the classrooms. Formative and summative assessment are both used to improve learning. In the 70s, formative assessment was said to be used to improve learning, and summative assessment was said to be used to grade students. Now we have certain types of summative assessment that we use, and that we don't use the results of those assessments in order to grade students. So we want to make a, we want to clarify the state of the art of the students' learning at a certain point in time. So I decided to make a kind of synthesis of some differences between assessment of learning and assessment for learning. So assessment of learning, as I said before, it's a synthesis of what students know and are able to do at a given point in time. Assessment for learning, I usually say that there are three things that are very important that assessment for learning does. First of all, it should at all times provide students with the information about what are the goals that we are trying to pursue. Where are we looking at? What are we doing? What are we heading to? Okay, what are we heading to? Where are we going? The other thing that assessment for learning does is, at a certain point, students should know the efforts that should be made in order to achieve those goals, in order to get there. And the other thing is that they must know at all, as many times as we can, of course, where they are. Where they are. They need to get an understanding, awareness of where they are and what efforts they are supposed to do in order to get there. So assessment for learning does this all the time. Why? How? With our feedback, with our dialogue with the students, and so forth. The other thing is, as we may see in this slide, assessment of learning is discrete. It's discrete, it's not continuous. The important distinction between assessment of learning and assessment for learning, one of them, of course, is that assessment of learning takes time at certain moments, throughout the curriculum, while we are developing curriculum. On the other hand, assessment for learning tends to be continuous. It's a big difference. Tends to be continuous because it takes place when we are teaching and where students are learning. That's why, in my opinion, we should use tasks, working proposals that we make to the students that has three different functions, those tasks. Imagine that I ask them to make a composition, for example, okay? And through that composition, I must teach them through that composition. They must learn through that composition, and both teacher and students can assess through that composition. And who says composition may say a mathematical problem, or a physics problem, or a search in the bookstore, or in the library, in a database, etc. On the other hand, feedback tends to be continuous in assessment for learning, although in assessment of learning it tends to be also. And anyway, you have other characteristics of assessment of learning and assessment for learning that I'm not going to elaborate right now because time is passing and I should finish pretty soon. So let me share with you some statements that I find quite important. As I said in the beginning, we are talking about classroom assessment, either for or of learning. So it's not a technical, I'm sorry, there is a mistake in technical. Uh, an N is missing, is not a technical question. This is very important. It's not a mere measurement, and it's not a question of instruments. Classroom assessment is a complex and fundamental pedagogical process. I'm talking about classroom assessment. It's not a mere question of using instruments to grade students. It's much more than that, of course. The other thing that I would like to share is classroom assessment cannot be seen as a grading process, particularly assessment for learning. It's never a grading process, assessment for learning. Of course, that's through assessments. I should have said through summative assessment, through assessment of learning, we can collect information that enables one to describe the quality of whatever is being assessed. Of course, that through assessment for learning, we also get crucial information in order to provide students with the feedback that helps them to make the decisions that allow them to learn what they probably didn't learn so far. Another thing, well, I talked quite a lot about feedback. Is the key, in my opinion, feedback is the key process of assessment. Is the key process. I said that is the real content of assessment for learning. Without feedback, assessment has no meaning, because is through feedback that I can help my students to get aware of what they are, where they are supposed to go, and what efforts that they should develop in order to learn. So feedback is a crucial point in any kind of conceptualization of assessment for learning. Finally, so we have several challenges here, challenges for the future. We need to talk about the future, of course, and about the present. But I would say that the first challenge, it's not for order. I don't mean this could be, the order here is not important. But first of all, I would like to call your attention, if I may, to the importance of integrating teaching, learning, and assessment. And this is made through tasks that have the three functions, as I mentioned to you before. We do not need many assessments. We need quality assessments. We don't need many things for students to do. We need that the things that we should provide them, the tasks, the problems, whatever you want to call it, but the tasks, the proposals of work, working proposals for students, they, through them, through those proposals, through those tasks, I should be able to teach, they should be able to learn, and both should be able to assess. The other thing, I didn't talk a lot about this. Actually, I spoke a little bit, but not enough. We should diversify assessment, teaching, and learning tasks. And we should engage students in the assessment processes through, for example, what we usually call pairs of students or students looking into the work of other students, and really it really works very well. I do it at university, and it works very well, and I did it when I was a secondary school teacher some years ago. Um, Finally, assessment for learning and for teaching. That is to improve both processes. We need to improve assessment for learning and assessment for teaching.
Professor, I would like just to comment and make some bridges here with the eTwinning projects and with what you do in eTwinning. And actually, we have been discussing and talking about feedback, and a crucial part of the eTwinning projects are feedback. And we discussed that recently in a learning event, and it's very interesting to see how we can easily make bridges here and relate the concepts with what we do every day in eTwinning projects. And as you can see, project-based learning fosters the assessment for learning. So once more, I would like to thank Professor Domingos Fernandes for being here, for accepting the invitation. It's really a pleasure to hear you every time. And I would like to just inform you that the upcoming seminars will be shared in the professional development page on eTwinning Live. Also, I will share with you, if the professor allows, the presentation with you through email, as well as the recording of this session. Okay, so soon you will learn from me. Pay attention to your email inbox. And yes, of course, you will receive a certificate of
Thank you.
attendance of this seminar. Thank you for being here, for commenting, for listening to us. And see you in the next seminar. Thank you, Professor, again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much.